Live streaming is on.
Okay, we're live. Uh, Let me check YouTube as usual because I don't trust YouTube because every day it says we're connected and then we are not. So since I don't trust YouTube, just 1 second, we are live. Hallelujah. Hello there, everybody. It's Monday or not, depending when you are, and if you're watching us live or not. So whatever. Hello, whatever time of day, morning, afternoon, evening, night, week, year. Well,
Hey,
year.
can
I hope you watch it this year. But by the
it
other
can be
side,
time. It's afternoon where you are. It's morning where I am.
that's also true. 9 hour difference, and he's getting up for us very early. So you gotta thank my friend here on the other side of this window. Just so you see, is the master, and above that, above being a master of drawing and creating comics, is an amazing human being. My dear friend John Bogdanove. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well. How are you, David?
Doing fine. Things here more or less going back to normal.
How's that transition working? Because it has not worked very well so far in the United States. We
um,
started to try and go back to normal and immediately got an explosion of COVID cases.
it's in any way in I love I love the process of how it was done here. It was very scientific, very step by step in phases and all that. But now, of course, everybody's worried because you have they opened the frontiers to the European Union,
Uh,
not to the United States, Brazil,
don't open.
Russia. As you
We don't believe.
as I guess the frontiers to those countries has been like this. We are not opening because, of course, they are afraid. So
Yeah.
with all the tourists that are coming from the rest of the European Union, starting this week, I think it is. Of course, there's the worry that the cases are going. There's going to be a second wave, but it seems to be under control. Yeah, and there's controls on the airports. Like they control your temperature. So there's like 3 tests, and you have to give all your information in case you're asymptomatic but become infected the next day
Yeah.
because it can happen. So they know where you are and they can confine you in a hotel or something.
Okay.
So you don't cause another mess.
That
But
seems prudent to me.
mhm.
That's like a very an intelligent way to go about it. But I mean, I suspect that a second wave is inevitable,
Mhm.
because that's just the way these plagues go, and also the virus mutates. So we will face a second wave. This is a an adventure that's going to last at least 2 years.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And maybe longer if they can't get a vaccine going.
Yeah, and the mutation, at least the science says until now, that this virus mutates less than the common flu. So that's not the part they're worried about. So for now, that's what the science is saying. Maybe it's science, and science can change. That's a part of science. When they know more things, people complaining about, oh, the science has changed in the last few months. Well, that's science. As
That is.
soon as you know things, that's what science does. It adapts.
Mhm.
I mean, if we couldn't adapt, we could be all dead in a year. So let them work. But in a way, that's not the part that worries me the most. The mutation. The part that worries me the most is people getting too comfortable. If you know what I mean.
Oh,
Oh,
sure.
first wave is on. It's over. Let's just go out and have fun.
Yeah, I think a good analogy is, I read somewhere that the average length of a diet is 2 weeks. That most people can stay on a diet for about 2 weeks and then they slip off of it. And I'm afraid that it sort of was that way over here with the masks. Everybody was really good about social distancing
Mhm.
and masks and everything for about 2 weeks. And people stayed off the roads, and the air quality improved. LA, as you know, which is a high degree of automobile air pollution, had the cleanest air of any city in the country for a while, and the best air that it's had since before World War II,
Mhm.
just because people got off the roads for 2 weeks.
Mhm.
But then, you know, people go back to their old ways because they just do, because we're animals, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And
The primal instinct. I agree.
yeah, and we're currently experiencing an upsurge because the whole country experimented with reopening,
Hmm.
but not in any cohesive way, not in any kind of um, uh, there are no real federal guidelines.
Yeah.
There's no, it's sort of haphazard. So some states just threw open the doors, and other people had a sort of a more careful rollout. But in any case, there's no real control over the rollout. So
Hmm.
we're experiencing now a second wave, which is we're pretty much spiking everywhere. And it's interesting. I go I walk about 25 miles a week. So when I'm out exercising, I see about half the people are wearing masks.
Hmm.
Half the people are maintaining strict 6 foot distances, and the rest have just like no, just given up, just caution to the wind. So I don't know what that says about human psychology, but that's what's happening.
That also depends on this what you're used to as a society. I mean, if you're used to the individual is the only thing that matters,
Mm,
and the other side is the group is what really matters. And I'm not
hmm
talking about Spain or the US. I mean in general. There's some countries that they have always have a more group mentality, and others that have a more individual. Like individual is the ones who wins, and in other countries is the team. And that reminds me of a really funny conversation I had years ago about what's the best basketball. I know it's not a good metaphor, I guess, but for me it always was about how different parts of the American culture and the European culture are, or Spanish even. It was like, oh no, the best. The other side was telling me, and I won't name names, but it was comics people. It was, hey, no, ours is the best because we have the best players. Like I don't know, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, blah blah blah. And my
Yeah.
answer was, no, I don't agree. Team play is what made the Spain world champion.
hmm
It wasn't because Pau Gasol was the best. It was because no, it was the team as a whole was better. So,
hmm
and that made me think about that's the mentality. Mentality says the individual is the one who makes you win,
hmm
and I was thinking no, the group is what makes you stronger.
Well, I mean, part of the charm of the United States is our infatuation with the myth of the rugged individual,
Yeah.
right? It dates back to the cowboy times and westward expansion, and it's probably a frame of mind that you know um, helped us eliminate the native population and enslave people.
Mhm.
uh, to because there's a fun and charming side to being a rugged individual. There's also a hugely detrimental side in that um, the culture of individualism sort of locks you into being a child as a culture.
Mhm.
In that, uh, you know, arguably everybody is sort of the star of their own life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But when you are a child, you are the center of the universe. And one of the hallmarks of maturity as you become an adult is that you realize, oh, right, there are a lot of other people to consider on this planet. There are other people with feelings. There are other people with needs. I'm not the only one.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that people can learn this as individuals, but not necessarily learn it as a culture.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and we there's an element of in modern United States, because we're no longer a frontier and haven't been for quite some time, that sort of individual culture of the rugged individualist has sort of developed into sort of tribalism. so that people can empathize with their own group and have a tremendously difficult time empathizing with anybody else's group.
Mhm.
And I'd like to think that the virus would select for selfish people, but sadly, it doesn't work that way.
No. What is the thing that you miss the most with this crazy thing?
What? Say again?
What is the thing that you miss the most?
Oh,
You know,
well,
if they told you, open doors, virus is out, you can go out, whatever the fuck you want to do, what's the first thing you could do?
I'd see our friends.
Mhm.
I'd see our friends. I mean, I joke often that life in lockdown, quarantine life for a comic book artist is pretty much normal life
Mhm.
because hi Kellel. Hey, Kellel and Judy are here with coffee.
Good, good.
Oh boy.
Give him the coffee. That's more important. We can make a pause for him to get the coffee.
Good coffee, darling. We're sitting here in our lovely backyard garden. So, I sometimes joke, and I used to joke a lot 100 days ago. Oh, quarantine life is the same as normal life for a comic book artist. We're always, isolated at our desk anyway. We're a socially isolated profession.
Yep.
But I really think that social isolation actually is one of the hazards of this work.
Yeah.
Because we don't work in sweatshops anymore. We all work by ourselves, locked away in some corner of the house. Life goes on around us while we spend, 12, 14, 18 hours a day drawing pictures.
Yeah.
So that makes the time that we're not drawing really important. That makes, because we spend so much time alone drawing, I think it makes the contact with our friends and the people we love, your chosen family,
Mm-hmm.
it makes it more vital, psychologically. And I miss that. I miss that most of all.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk on Jitsi like we're doing now. We can talk on Zoom, but it's not, and we do. We're actually, our gang, our circle is pretty good about staying in touch. And I text a tremendous amount, but it's not the same as just having people over, hanging out in the garden, grilling some hamburgers. I miss that a lot.
Yeah, I was, with most everybody, but like Jaking, Marv, and all the others, we kept going back to the same thing. People ask me, "Oh, do you miss conventions?" And like, no, not really. What I miss is the people at the conventions. Like, what do you mean?
Yes.
I miss hanging out with my friends that I see once or twice a year, and after that, you go to dinner, and suddenly somebody you couldn't expect is there, and it's like,
Yep.
oh my god, I haven't seen you in ages. Let's just sit down and talk.
Yeah.
And then you leave for the day, and the question, by your partner, by Judy in your case, or by my wife is, oh, you had dinner with this. Like, no, I had dinner with that one that I haven't seen in 15 years.
I know it's that is the blessing of conventions, and I know that there are people trying to develop virtual conventions.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how well that's taking shape. I don't know how well that actually works, because I think there is something about human interaction that's almost on an energetic level, not to get woo-woo about it, but there's something about human beings. I think we evolved as social creatures.
Yes.
I think, without hairless apes, without fangs, without claws, if we didn't rely on each other, if we didn't develop love for each other, we would not have survived. We would have been basically a food source for saber-toothed tigers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that human interaction in person is irreplaceable. I think we need it psychologically, I think we need it just because it's hardwired into us by evolution.
Yeah.
And I don't think that any kind of, I mean, all this technology is wonderful, but I don't think anything will ever replace. Oh, the squirrels are freaking out.
What are they doing?
Holy mackerel,
They're falling out of the trees.
dudes! We have very emphatic squirrels. I don't think anything will ever replace conventions, and not just because of that joyous after the show go out and grab a bite with someone you haven't seen for 15 years, but honestly, I think conventions are good because it's really important to meet your audience.
Yeah.
And again, when you work in isolation, it's really important to be reminded that there is an audience and that they are people. Often they become friends,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're working for them. You're not working in a vacuum. You're working to entertain and connect with someone on a human level. So conventions are important for that. They're important for the human connection, both on the professional side and on the interaction with fans side. Generally speaking, when I go to a convention, that's sort of just that gets blurred a little bit, the line between fans and just friends. And also, travel. I walk every day, but I haven't been more than 8 miles away from my home in 100 days. and I miss, I miss traveling. I like going to other parts of the world and seeing how other people live, and seeing friends who come from a different background.
Mm-hmm. Why? Let me rephrase. Of course, you started drawing as a kid, as most kids do, I guess, and then you got to do comics. But the question here is, why comics? Why not illustration? Why not storyboarding for movies or TV? Why comics was the thing that said, this is what I want to do, this is what I have to do, this is what is closest to my heart?
Well, the greatest strength of comics as an art form is that anyone can do it, literally. It doesn't require a lot of technical equipment. It doesn't require a lot of education or social connections. In other words, if you're a poor kid like me, who parents couldn't, send you to college, if you didn't have access to other options and you wanted to be an artist, I mean, even painting is expensive, right? Because oil paints cost a lot of money. Cadmium is a very expensive metal, but paper and pencil is cheap. So comics are an accessible art form to almost anybody, in the same way that they're easily understood because of the combination of words and pictures. They're also easily created. I mean, in that it takes very little education or experience to be able to do a reasonably good comic. Like anything else, mastery requires 10,000 or more hours, but the entry point is very low on the ladder.
I don't agree. I've been many times you artists take things for granted, and I am here to say, no, don't. Look, let me repeat again what I say to most of you. That's not true. It's not that easy to. It's, in fact, for me, it's the most difficult art of all.
One second, David. There's a jet plane heading overhead. I'm going to step over here where it's a little quieter and maybe hear you a bit better. Just until the jet goes.
Fine.
Okay.
I was gonna say most of your artists, tell that to me, and my answer is no. That's not true. It's not easy at all. For me, in fact, it's the most difficult art because in any other art, the sequence is flowing. In an illustration, you just portray an idea, etc., a concept. In comics, you gotta be able to tell what happens between the panels, to alliterate, to make people understand what they don't see. The art is not in what you see; it's what you don't see, and to make them believe that everything they don't see, it's working. And that's not easy. And you gotta be wired in a certain way. I know people who can't read comics because, for whatever reason, they just can't fill in the gaps. And it's the same with artists. There's not that many artists who are able to draw with that alliteration, with that. Okay, the information I'm giving you is lacking a lot of pieces, which is what's in between the gathers, to say in a way. It's not that easy. It's very, very difficult to think that way and to be able to storytell and compose every single page, especially in a monthly, in a way that people can understand it.
Well, I also enjoy illustration, and I love animation. I might have been an animator if I had access to those advantages, those privileges. But I think what I like about comic books is that drawing comics is not illustration.
Mhm.
There are a lot of wonderful draftsmen, illustrators, who do comic books not very well. And that's because I think drawing comics has more to do with being a writer than being an artist. In other words, there are many people who draw better than I do.
Mhm.
They do, oh, stop. No, I mean, in terms of,
That's not true.
there's many people who draw better than I do.
And a lot more than draw worse than you do. So yeah.
Better anatomy, more lavish backgrounds. But the difference, I think, what makes me viable in the business is that drawing comic books is about telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
It's about providing the reader triggers for their imagination. Scott McCloud said that, comics really happen in the gutters between.
Yep.
And I think that's very true. I think that comic book artists are writers who use have a good day, son. Fellow's going off to work.
Take care, Khalil. Bye.
He's for those who don't know, Kal-El is a voice and performance director on video games,
Mm-hmm.
Primarily video games, some animation and stuff too. And his industry is currently in transition, so that he is working from home.
Mm-hmm.
And they're experiencing the same thing we are, in that, yes, you can work remotely. It just takes a little bit of technology, but missing the human element
Mm-hmm.
of
Absolutely.
personal contact. Anyway, to get back on point. So with comics, you're trying to convey motion, sensation, you're trying to activate all senses in a person's imagination, in a very epigrammatic way.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, beautiful comic book storytelling the readers imagine art form, because they're very, very intimate.
Mm-hmm.
They really are a collaboration between the reader and the artist,
Yes,
the writer.
absolutely.
Which is why you get fans coming to you conventions saying, Superman would never do this, because And they're right, because in their everybody's Superman is different. Everybody's character is different because the miracle happens inside them.
Mm-hmm.
And if I've done my job properly, what I've done is I've provided their imagination the triggers that it's hungry for,
Mm-hmm.
that inspires their imagination to, excuse me, there's text coming up. And that what I think is, even if I did have access to the education to become an animator, even if I did live in the age of the great illustrators like Howard Pyle and Nancy Wyeth, even if all of that were true, I think I'd still want to do comics,
Mm-hmm.
because of the essential qualities of that art form. There's nothing quite else like it. And the artistic challenge of finding just exactly how to connect with someone's imagination, so that you fire their imagination.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of collaboration is the most fun, it's the most interesting challenge for me.
I love that you talk about the collaboration between the reader and the artist and the creator in a way. I completely agree, because the reader, if the story is not a story told in a way, the storytelling is not correct, that thing that should happen between the panels, that composition, it takes him 3 milliseconds to notice. Even if they don't know what they're talking about, like, I don't like the story, I don't like the art. No, I don't know what's going on. They don't know they're talking about the storytelling or the technical part, but they notice in a second, because it gets you out of the story really quickly. The suspension of disbelief in a way.
And some of it is the chemistry between reader and creator, in that everybody's tastes are different. So, for example, I connect really strongly with Jack Kirby. That's no surprise to anyone, I'm sure. There are people who look at Jack's work and just think it's ugly, and they don't really get it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some people that need a high degree of realism in order to connect with the story, and there are other people that really need a more expressive, cartoony, exaggerated style in order to connect. So it varies from person to person, and I know that personally, I'm a fan of certain writers, and there are writers whose comic I will pick up just because their name is on it. But then if the art inside doesn't translate that writer's work immediately in the way that connects with me, I lose it, I lose it.
Yeah.
So there's something so immediate about the connection between the artist and the audience that immediately. You can stand in a comic book shop in front of a row in front of an avalanche of imagery, and know within seconds which one you want to pick up and look into more.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the instinct that many times I also tell young creators, when they talk about the readers, sometimes dismissively. My answer is, they know a lot more than you do. They can pick up your mistakes in a millisecond, even if they don't know. And I'm not talking about the assholes who are looking for them to, wrong pants or that stupid shit. But I'm talking about readers who know and love comics as much or more as we do as creators. So in a way, you can respect them because they know a lot more than you do. Respect what they do, because they're going to be able to pick it up as you said, they look at 50 covers and they know the one that speaks to them.
Mm-hmm. Human beings are really good at nonverbal communication. As a species, we evolved to read rapid fire micro expressions,
Yeah.
okay, facial expressions. Another reason, back to talking about COVID again, but that's another reason people are resistant, I think, to wearing masks, because we've evolved to communicate and judge our social environment by the micro expressions and gestures of our fellow human beings.
Yeah.
In other words, every one of us, in a single sentence, I may say 6 words, but in those 6 words, I may go through a dozen or more micro expressions or gestures, each of which the human brain registers. Even if you don't register it consciously, you're reading it.
Yep.
And it tells you something. It tells you something about who I am, what my intentions are, etc. It's very interesting. If I'm wearing sunglasses and a mask, right? Find that when I'm out in public, that I have to sort of exaggerate my gestures in such a way as to put people at ease, because I'm kind of a big guy anyway, right? And so when I'm out exercising, if I'm coming at you down the trail, I find that I trigger fear in people because they can't read my face. They can't see my face. So I tried with exaggerated movements to not be scary.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? To compensate for the fact that people can't read the micro expressions on my face.
Yeah.
And that for me translates to comics in a way that's very, very useful as a storyteller. Because you only have a few expressions, a few gestures on a page. It's a fraction of the number that you get in real life. So selecting the right expression and the right nuanced expression to capture what a person is saying, and to try and capture not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it, why they're saying it, what they're feeling, to try and boil the dozens of micro expressions that we all go through every day into just one image is incredibly challenging and really fun.
Yeah.
It's well, this way, it's really fun when you don't screw it up.
Yeah.
It's really fun when it works.
What else I was going to add is that I think comics is the best tool to show how our primal instincts work. And I mean, there's nothing small enough to be said about pattern recognition. And I mean, pattern recognition is what keeps us alive as a species for all these, centuries, which is like rustles, in a feather. Oh shit, there's a saber tooth, as you said before. Yeah. It's gonna kill us. Fucking run away. So, but it's also bad because, we recognize patterns like some crazy people, they see a sandwich and they think it's Jesus Christ or something like that. But going serious, and comics uses pattern recognition in a way that no other art does. Because a small slight thing is telling you, oh, that thing is whatever, is the corner of Batman's cape, because you've seen it so many times, you don't even need to think about it. It's there.
Comics are... I've learned a lot about comics from actually manga, and I'm not a big manga reader, but I had a lot of students who are, and they've been very, very good teachers for me in sharing with me what they love about manga. And the lesson there is that comics and manga are ideographic, and that all comics exist on a spectrum between symbol, like content, and photographic realism.
Yes. And
everybody's work is somewhere in along that spectrum of realism. For example, Jack Kirby is closer to ideographic expression. He's more cartoony than, say, Neil Adams.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You know, Neil Adams being a sort of a mid-century modernist. Although it's an odd example because Neil is an interesting mix of expressionist of the school of Jack Kirby, literally, and modern realism. That's one of the things I like about Neil, actually, is that his work has sort of a dynamic tension between the pure expressionist in him and the naturalist, modernist
Yeah.
Realism.
Yeah, but we could also go with, Garcia Lopez or even Alex Raymond in the way of we go all the way back, throw the needle and we go all the way back to classic Greece. And then with Kirby, it's going to sound crazy. I'm sorry, kill me if you don't agree. We go all the thread and we go to Egyptians. Ideographic against, classic realism.
Yeah. Jack is more ideographic, but when I think of hieroglyphs, I think really of an art form that is entirely ideographic.
Okay. Now see what you mean.
It's a combination. I mean, it's all drawn on a very two-dimensional plane, right? A lot of figures from the side. So even though it's representative, it's really written like it's really drawn like a written language, as a series of symbols, and that's comics are often associated with hieroglyphs, but they really explode hieroglyphs because they play in all dimensions.
Absolutely.
And they go way beyond symbolism. In other words, if you're looking at, you can study the face of Horus on the wall of an Egyptian temple and not discern any particular nuance of expression. It's just Horus. He means something, right? But in comics and manga as well, there are nuances of expression, and it's very interesting in manga because one of the things that puts American comic book readers off of manga is the ideographic quality of the faces. So everybody's face is the same, blah 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 blah. However, manga is very expressive, but the facial expressions are almost symbols. Like this is a symbol of surprise. This is a symbol of anger. This is a symbol of love. And there's of course variation in that. Some artists are more Western. Some artists are more ideographic. But the lesson from manga for me is that it's important when trying to capture the nuance in moment to remember the ideographic side, and that people are looking at things for a second, for less than a second, for a nanosecond, so they have to be able to register what you're saying. So simplification and a reliance on simplified symbols is one of our tools.
Yeah.
And it's a tool that Western artists would be wise to pay attention to, and it's been useful in my career. On the other hand, I would feel terrible if all I had to rely on was an ideographic language of images, because that quiver is just too small. It's too restricted. And for me, the real joy is capturing a face with a mix of emotions, capturing ambivalence, capturing
The internal struggle.
profound feeling.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes very subtle,
Mhm.
right? And can't be reduced to a chibi,
Yeah. But also, comics have enough restrictions as they are, being, trying to make three-dimensional what we have in two dimensions of paper. So every tool you can use, by the end of the day, you are going to want to use it, right? Like, yeah, I just have
Absolutely.
that. I will just restrict myself all I can. No, you just want to explore everything you can, right?
Yes, and this can actually be a problem. I'm working on a project now that it's a hard science fiction project. It relies a lot on technology and also the nature of the story is sort of a locked room horror,
Mm-hmm.
and so stylistically it wants a certain amount of reserve, and or at least that's what I thought when I started. As I got into it, so I started out drawing with a more reserved, more realistic, more sort of European graphic album style.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that worked as it opened up. But then as the story evolved and the emotions got more raw and the action started to unfold, I find my cartoonier nature creeping in more because I can't help using every tool at my disposal
That's
to
what.
tell a particular story.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure if that's a failing or not. It might be a failing.
Maybe not. Let me ask you
because-
this. Let me interrupt and ask you this. Because sometimes people consider it a failing, and I go back and ask, maybe not. Maybe that's the characters telling you you're wrong. And I say the same to writers. Do characters argue back at you and tell you this is not the right path? And all the good writers, except Greg Rucka the last week, when I asked him, do your characters argue back at you? And he was like, all the time. And if they didn't, I could be worried. They have to argue back. They have to tell you, no, this is not the right path. And he was telling me the story about one of his Atticus Kodiak novels. And he was telling me he had the first act, the second act. He was pretty sure that everything was okay. He had the ending. And when he got to the end of the second act, all his characters, not one, all his characters says, this is all wrong. You cannot
Yeah.
go right. And he had to go and redo the whole novel. I had like a 2-week crisis when he was, I'm a failing. I don't know what to do with my life until, he picked the story and finished it. But he's like, look, it was horrible then. But now, when I remember it, that was probably the most important learning spot for me as a writer, when I realized you got to listen to your characters.
Yes, and the same thing is true of theme. I'll very often think I know what the message is in what I'm drawing or writing, and I'll start. And this is almost always a mistake. I'll start consciously building a thesis, a thematic statement, and the characters along the way will take their own path. And I won't realize until the end that, oh no, this was the theme all along. So, yeah, there's a certain organic program to it.
And
I don't know.
Same with the art, it tells you where to go. I mean, what you're saying, you started more realistic, and then the cartoonier side took over. Is that your character saying, no, that wasn't the idea. You should have gone in this direction?
Yeah, and and it's odd because if I'm doing commercial work, if I'm doing like style guide work for DC licensing, I can switch artist styles like this. If you want, Kurt Swan, I can do it. If you want Wayne Boring, I can do it. If you want Neil Adams, I can do Neil Adams fairly well. Not as good as the maestro himself, but I can draw in a fairly wide variety of styles. I've even learned to imitate Maestro Garcia Lopez.
Wow.
And it's, yeah, that's pretty hard.
Yeah.
But only in individual illustrations.
Yeah.
Only in style guide sense. The minute I try to restrict my style when I'm telling a story, the characters and the situations take over.
Mhm.
And there are probably artists that can restrict their styles, but I find that, and the story I'm doing now is very different from my superhero work, but my style is being dictated by the story.
Mm-hmm.
The approach is being dictated by the story. I can't consciously say, well, I'm going to draw like Bernie Krigstein today, because unless it's a Krigsteiny moment, unless it's a Krigstein kind of story, I'm going to do what the story demands,
Mm-hmm.
as best as I know how, and so I can't fake another style so well when I'm telling a story. The story is the story, and there's an interaction that happens between artist and story where you have to let the story be the boss.
Yeah. Are you writing it too?
I'm not writing it. No, actually, Kal-El wrote it.
Nice.
Kal-El and April are writing it.
Nice.
Yeah.
The other day with Charlie Adler, we had a really fun moment when I had to explain. You are going to call me crazy again. I'm used. Don't worry about it. If you call me crazy, because that's the usual in my life, especially from my wife. But we were talking about. I told him that comics is the only thing that in the universe that can defy Einstein's relativity. And he was like, "Well, you need to explain that." And I was like, "This is the only art form where you can manipulate time at will, where you can just go faster, use 22 pages or 20 now for a single moment. Go do a scene Watchmen where you see something in the background in panel 5, page 7, issue 1, and then you go to issue 5, and then that was all along, and it's taking you to the same moment, and you never knew that the time that happened, that it was in a different time." So I love comics as all of everything else I was saying, because you guys are the masters of time, not the Doctor Who, that shit. That's, the real masters of time are comic creators, because reader never know, if you want to, when is it happening and where they are. They know where, but they don't know when.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the biggest and most fun challenges of comics is governing time, because and its most basic terms, every panel is a moment in time, and you've chosen that moment for a reason. But depending on all sorts of factors, like the size of the panel, the width of the gutter, the size and shape of the panel in relation to the other panels around it, the depth of field, the composition, all of those factors can be manipulated to either make that moment in time longer
Mm-hmm.
or quicker.
Mm-hmm.
So the pacing of storytelling is really, really fun. And I think people that rely too much on splash imagery, which was very popular in the 90s.
Yes, and
Just
almost killed the industry.
Yeah. I mean, they're fun to draw and they're quick to draw, but if you are relying too much on 2 panel pages and one of the panels is a splash, you are restricting yourself to one particular expression of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like, if every note is loud, none of them are loud.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So it gets boring. And it's really the interplay of short moments and long moments, and whatever moment that the story that point in the story requires. That's fun. And I don't know why anyone would want to restrict themselves. Any artist would want to restrict themselves from using any of the tools available,
Well, in a way, let's be honest, because splash pages and all that, they sell for more money. So,
well, yeah, they were. They were popular at the time. They
Yeah.
were popular at the time, but it didn't last.
no, fortunately, it didn't, and the industry was dying. So it's a good thing that they didn't.
And there are, I'm not slamming big action splashes, because there's a place for that.
hmm
And I use them myself when it's appropriate, because sometimes you need a splash is good because it expresses big action. It also expresses tableau.
hmm
It becomes illustration, not just a moment in time. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So you can use a splash to make a moment more iconic,
Yes.
to give it more weight, to
Mhm.
give so it's useful for things like the coup de grace in a story, or the climax of a story. But unless it's juxtaposed against other kinds of moments and other expressions of time, if just every page is sort of the same, after a while, all you can see are the flaws.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
But that's the same as in in TV shows when they rely 90% certain TV shows on middle shots.
Yeah.
Like everything is boring because they don't move. It's like middle shot. Or in the movie directors who don't trust themselves too much, and everything is close-ups.
Yes.
Everything is close-ups, and you are like, just move the camera. Go away. Go away. Go away.
Well,
No, because they don't trust themselves, so everything is close like this. So that all the emotions are lost because everything you see are this, and that should be special, as in comics, of course.
well, yes. On the other hand, I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I can see a situation where a director might want to create a feeling of claustrophobia,
True.
right? Where he wants the audience to feel a little bit like, oh, for crying out loud, I don't want to be that close to somebody's pores. If you're trying to make the audience uncomfortable and feel like the characters are being too aggressively confrontational,
hmm
using all close-ups might be the way to go, because it certainly could. But if you're just, I think it has something to do with intent, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
If you're using all close-ups intentionally because you are trying to create a particular atmosphere or a particular reaction in your audience, that's one thing. If you're using close-ups because you can't afford any sets, that's another thing.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's also the reliance on, if you put the camera close, you see the faces and the emotions, and they think, and I've talked to directors who've told me this to my face, they think the audience relates better if there's a lot of close-ups. And I always answer the same thing. Is there's too many? No, they don't, because you take them away. They don't believe the
Yeah.
emotion if you have a close-up every 5 seconds.
Yep.
That would be like in comics, as I said, if you have 2 close-ups or 3 close-ups as a rule per page, like, no, I gotta portray the emotion, so let's just put a close-up or 2 in every page. I gotta do it in every page. Like, no, I understand there's rules, like all editors used to tell me you gotta have probably you heard this years ago. I used to get from editors years ago, like 20 years ago, every artist should have a rule. Every page should have an establishing shot, a middle ground shot, in a close-up. And I was like, in every page? Why? Oh, that's the rules. Like, well, the rules are there to bend them, to be bent, right?
Right. I mean, At Marvel, we have a term that I still use today called shooter proofing. And for those of you who don't know what shooter proofing is, Jim Shooter, very controversial character, and I'm not going to get into the controversy of Jim Shooter, but when Jim was in charge of Marvel, and in his best days, he was a master of clear storytelling. That was his thing. The idea being that if you can't get your audience the basic information they need to understand what's going on,
Mhm.
I mean, that's sort of job one.
Yeah.
So Jim had certain rules that we would all try to follow, and generally speaking, he was right. Generally speaking, at some point in the first 5 pages, you want to introduce all your characters. You want to be able to see them from head to foot somewhere in those first 5 pages, and you want to see some expression of their powers, so you know where people are.
Yeah, I remember once that one artist told me that Shooter never allowed Wolverine's claws to be cut in a panel. He always said if he has the claws, they have to be inside the panel. Never cut them with the panel cutter, because if you're showing his powers for the first time, you cannot cut the claws.
Right, and in principle, he was right. He wasn't always right, because there are times, as you say, when the story demands the rule be broken.
Yeah.
Right. But it's important to break the rules consciously. If you're going to break the law, you should know what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And why. So rules like, I think of rules as more like guidelines. Yes, you need to have an establishing shot to let the reader know where they are. Do you need an establishing shot on every page? Well, generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb, but not always. And if you're going to break it, know why. Have a reason to break it, right? And you don't always, sometimes if you're in the middle of an intense scene, you don't want to pull back and show the establishing shot again. You don't always want to do that. But generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. I think it's a good rule for beginners. And I still use it to, with new artists, to tell them, just to test yourself, try to go in every page from establishing shot to middle ground to close up. Try to have at least one to learn. But then when they know, it's like, now you can bend the rules or break it, because now you control it. Until you control that, you need to have those stages, because it'll force you to storytell, going from one position to the other, and not to stay in the comfort zone, which is, always middle ground.
Right. Well, and sometimes you want to go from the close-up out to the establishing shot.
Yeah.
And
No, but I never tell them the order. That you have to go from establishing to close-up. You have both. I don't care the order. I don't care if you start from here and go here, or you start here and you go there. Just try to move between distance, establishing, and close-up. The order is in your hands, but that's the rule you have to learn to do as an artist, and then break it. But learn how it works, and then you break it. As you said, to bend the rules or break them, you have to be able to control them. It's like trying to manipulate time as a comic artist without knowing how to shape the panels, in a certain way that makes things go slower or faster. Many times I see young artists trying to do that, and first you can understand how it works, and then you do this, because now you don't understand how pacing works in terms of relation with the shape of the panels.
This is how you develop mastery, because rules are guidelines that help you master the basics. And as you get better with the basics, you learn how to break the rules more and more. And it's very tempting when you're starting out, because as a reader, before you ever tell a story visually, you can understand the sophisticated rule breaking of a master, because a master is successful at breaking the rules.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a master to read a master's work. But when you're just starting out, there's a temptation to try and do what the masters were doing. And it's good to, it's essential to always remember your basics. And the best way to do that is to use the rules, particularly when you're learning. Use the rules.
Yeah, it's fun because when when young artists trying to go too fast, I will send it to you later. So if you don't remember what I'm talking about, there was an old ad with Carl Lewis, a Pirelli app, where it was Carl Lewis with high. Yet again.
I'm sorry, we live in a flyway.
Don't worry about it. So the ad was Carl Lewis, the athlete with high heels, and the ad said, "Speed without control means nothing." So many times when when new guys want to break the rules from the beginning, I just get this ad, send it by email, and say, "This is the important thing. You cannot control your speed yet, so what you're doing doesn't make sense. You still don't know how to control it."
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, so we have some questions from people. Are you okay answering them?
Sure, of course.
Okay, let's go, because I told you guys I wasn't forgetting about you. We could get to your questions. So Stanley Man says, "Hello, I was wondering what makes a good panel layout. What tools do you use while making comics, and what is your process for designing a character like a Steel? Thank you in advance. Big fan, Bertie." Okay, so that's 3 questions. First one, what makes a good panel layout for you, John?
Well, I mean, I don't have a good answer for that, because every story moment is different. So whatever conveys what I want to convey is what works. So if a splash is the way to go, I'll use a splash. If a bunch of tight little uniform 9-panel Dave Gibbons grid is what's going to work, then that's what I'll use. So there's no restriction for me in terms of panel layout. My process for determining panel layout, I can tell you what that is, with the caveat that everybody's is different. So everyone's process for breaking down a page is different. Mine is different from Walter's, which is different from Neil Adams. But I will, reading through a plot, and it may be a plot that I've written, or it may be a plot that someone else has written. I don't really like working full script, because that's restrictive. So I prefer to work Marvel way. But I'll read through a scene, and it all starts with play acting in your head. Of course, it all starts with living it in your imagination. So I fantasize and visualize the story as if I were in it, and from that experience, I will extract key moments. So in practical terms, that means going through the plot and making little, and at the start of each panel, and say, okay, that's one panel, that's another panel, this is another panel. And usually, if I'm working with a writer like Louise Simonson, exactly, more than any other writer I've ever worked with, knows exactly how to trigger the artist's imagination optimally. So she might describe a page of art in a single paragraph of, say, 5 sentences. Most often, that's an indication that one sentence per page, 1 sentence per panel. But I will go through and I will double check that. I will put panel 1, okay, panel 2. Those two should sort of be combined. And then somewhere in there, I will identify a key image, whatever has the most punch, whatever image is the point of the page, right? So sometimes it's an action shot, sometimes it's a reaction, a personal reaction, sometimes it's a nuanced gesture, but somewhere on that page will be an image that strikes me as the point of the page, the real reason for the page. Every page of comic books, every page of comics is sort of a story in itself.
Yeah.
Right. One of the reasons we have that rule about establishing shot, medium shot, close up, is because every page of comics has sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a climax, there's a setup, there's a climax, and there's a resolution on almost every page. Even insignificant moments in the story are sort of structured like that. And when I read a plot, I sort of sense what that narrative structure is. And so I identify the setup, the key moment, and the resolution. The resolution is usually a cliffhanger moment to drive the reader to the next panel, to the next page, right? Because what you're doing is you're getting them to turn pages. So I will identify what the panels are, and then I will identify within those panels what's the setup, what's the payoff, what's the key image. Might not be a payoff, could be something else. What's the point of the page, and what's the resolution / cliffhanger. And then I will start thumbnailing. And when some people thumbnail, they'll draw a little grid of the panel and they'll break it up into panels and blah blah blah. And they're going from the design end. I think Walter kind of works that way. He'll start from the design end. I usually start from somewhere inside the emotion. So I'll very often start by trying to capture a particular emotion or a particular action or a particular gesture or a particular expression. And when I've got that, and I'll start with the key image. And when I've got that, I'll sort of work my way out from that back to the setup and forward to the resolution, so that everything serves the key moment of the page. So that in other words, I want the important message of every page, the important story of every page, to be served by the artwork, and not to let, for instance, if there's an establishing shot on the page, but the establishing shot is not the point of the page, I don't want it to dominate what is the point of the page. Right? If the point of the page is somebody's subtle gesture, somebody's subtle expression, a reaction to something, I don't want to diminish that by doing a big lavish establishing shot.
Absolutely.
So I'll try to make everything in the layout serve the narrative structure of that page, and everything in the narrative structure of that page serve the key moment of that page.
So in a way, that's guiding your reader towards what the focus point of your panel you want it to be, right?
Well, what I'm trying to do is carry the reader on a certain arc of emotion, right? Yes, I want them to have all the necessary expositional information so they know what's going on.
Mhm.
But through that basic understanding of what's going on, I want them to have certain emotional feelings,
Yes.
excitement over the action, empathy for the character, whatever the story requires. I want them to have the experience they're supposed to have when they're supposed to have it, and I want them to have it optimally. I don't want them to miss anything good. My job is to make sure they get the most juice out of this comic book reading experience that they possibly can.
The second question was from Stanley Mann. What tools do you use to make comics?
From a practical standpoint, I use a combination of paper and pencil and digital.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I'll discuss the thing I'm working on right now, the hard sci-fi thing, because it is technically the most challenging thing I've ever done. If you know my work, you know that my strengths is character work. It's action and emotion and character acting. My weakest thing is probably inventing tech, right? So I don't have Jack Kirby's knack for bullshitting machinery. So the technology that I'm using is as follows. I start with paper and pencil in the way that I talked about, breaking down a plot, thumbnailing it, doing gesture drawings, construction drawings, in bits and pieces, very often in the borders of the plot. Then I will scan all those bits and pieces and scraps of paper and junk. I will scan it into the computer. And hang on, I got to plug in my phone. Sorry, guys.
Bye.
Hang on. Then I'll scan that stuff into the computer, and I will assemble it into a. Sorry, disappearing for a second while I plug in.
It's fine.
There we go. That should work.
There we go.
Okay. So when I have everything scanned, I will assemble it using Clip Studio these days, but you can use Photoshop, whatever, and digitally arrange those bits into a layout, right? And at that point, I'll rule the panel borders digitally, because why not? And I'll work on the background sometimes. For instance, if I'm doing a background that involves a lot of technology and a lot of architecture that that would be hard to draw on the boards, I will I'll use the computer to create my perspective grids with the tools that the program provides, and draw, at least Greek that stuff in digitally. Or in some cases, I will kit bash CAD models. So I've got a lot of CAD models that I downloaded from SketchUp when SketchUp was free, and I will sometimes explode those and combine them. So, for instance, I built an embryonics lab out of a variety of things, including a poker table, some computer monitors, a spark plug blown up really giant, just odd bits and pieces. In a way similar to the way they built the Millennium Falcon.
Mm-hmm.
You know how the Millennium Falcon, if you really look up close at it, it's got model car parts all over it.
Yeah.
That's essentially what I'm doing with computer models.
Mm-hmm.
And this is particularly useful if I'm designing a background that I'm going to use repeatedly. So I'll kit bash CAD models into something I can reuse, and then I'll just pose it so that it fits my figures.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll take a screen grab of it and I'll fit it into my layout digitally.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, I've got a layout in the computer that is comprised of my thumbnail sketches and gesture sketches and construction sketches, and either a perspective grid or a CAD model background fitted in there. And then I'll flatten it all out into blue line and print it off onto Bristol board. And then I will take the Bristol board back to the desk and I'll draw it old school.
Mm-hmm.
I will pencil and ink the figures in the old way. And I do this for several reasons. I have done everything digitally. I did Batman 66 entirely in the computer. But I missed having the physical artifact of the work. I like having original artwork.
Mm-hmm.
Also, drawing on paper, I tend to get more happy accidents, right? Fortunate things that are unconscious, because there's probably just because I learned on paper and pencil. I do things by intuition sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that I wouldn't do drawing digitally, because working digitally, I'm being very technical and conscious of technique all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And on paper, I can do something and say, whoa, that was really cool, without realizing that I've done it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, working digitally, you have the advantage of being able to zoom in really tight. And I realized when I was doing Batman 66 Green Lantern, Green Hornet,
Mm-hmm.
that I had drawn henchmen the size of a dried currant as complete portraits of actual friends. It should have been a tiny oval with 2 dots for eyes, because
Mm-hmm.
that's all you can really see. But because I was working digitally, I had zoomed right in and done lavish portraits of every single henchman in the background. So, that was completely lost.
Mm-hmm.
The reader didn't see that at all. So I like working on paper because I like having the finished product, and also it keeps me from going in too small or too
Going too crazy. Felipe González.
if you get a microscope,
Uh-huh.
if you want to treat, pick up the pages I did on Green Hornet, Batman 66, and put it under a microscope and look in the backgrounds.
Okay.
It's a tremendous amount of work back there.
Okay, Felipe González Hernández asks, hello, Mr. Bogdanov. I consider X-Men versus Fantastic Four one of your great works and a very realistic representation of the characters. How did this project come into your hands?
Oh, like everything in my life, I'm a very, very lucky person. And one of my greatest blessings was to fall in with the Simonsons, Walter and Louise Simonson, who are, probably the greatest people ever in comics. And it was through Louise that I was introduced to Chris Claremont.
Mm-hmm.
And through Chris Claremont to editor Mike Carlin. So really, everything springs from the Simonsons, and especially from Louise. But Chris and Mike invited me to draw that book. And, you know, Fantastic Four is my favorite Marvel property, except maybe for Power Pack.
Mhm.
But by me, with the Fantastic Four, Jack invented the family sitcom superhero adventure, and I just love the dynamic of those characters because they're a dysfunctional family, and of course the X-Men are too. But there's something about the FF that I really resonate with. Probably Ben. But here I had the opportunity. Here was Chris Claremont, who the maestro of writing the X-Men, and he was pitting Marvel's two greatest dysfunctional families against each other. How could I not want to do that?
Of course.
I mean, I would have worked with Chris on anything, because he's a particularly good writer for what I do. Chris has a knack that Wheezy has of writing for their artist.
Yes.
In other words, both writers take into account who their artist is on a particular project, and then they feed them what they know those artists excel at, right? So both writers are so good at sort of bringing out the best in you as an artist. And that was really the case with, I mean, that's why Fantastic Four versus the X-Men is so good, is because Chris knew, and I don't know how he knew this. I mean, I'd only drawn a handful of Power Packs at the time, but somehow Chris knew exactly what my greatest strengths were, and he played right to it.
Let me see. Pedro de Mercader asked one question that you have probably only been asked a million times. What was the hardest thing of building an ambitious crossover with so many creative teams, such as the death of Superman?
What was the hardest thing about it?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer because mostly I tend to remember the fun. I think the hardest thing, well, clearly the hardest job was Mike's, Mike Carlin.
Absolutely.
Because he had to, he had a room full of 12 incredibly passionate creators, all pushing their own agendas and trying to work together. And it was his his job to govern all of that. But I think that the hardest part of all of that was getting to draw the scenes we really wanted to draw. I mean, I think we did a pretty good job about everybody getting to do a bit of the stuff they really wanted to do. But sometimes I would feel like I don't get to draw Superman hitting people enough. I'm mostly drawing a lot of Lois and Jimmy and civilian reaction stuff. And I understand that's one of my strengths. But when I look back at my run on Superman, he's either dead or with long hair wearing a black costume or something. And I feel like I would have liked to have drawn a little more straight up Superman classic action. That might be the hardest thing, but really I'm nitpicking there because let's face it, the death of Superman and my whole run on Superman was the making of my life and the most fun I've ever had.
Yeah. Rita Carambola just wants to send you, John, you're a superb artist, a master of expressivity and body language. I love your work in X-Men versus FF, Exterminators, and Power Pack, and I just wanted to tell you that.
Oh, thank you so much. A shout out to anybody who loves Power Pack, because that's, of course, was a total labor of love.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Okay. Pedro says, who made and how was the decision made, that that Superman was going to die and come back? I guess it was all Mike, right?
No. I mean, I don't mind telling the story again.
I was just trying to skip it.
Basically, and I'll try to keep this brief, because yes, it's been recorded about 1 million times.
Yes.
Elsewhere.
I told you guys to not ask the same question he's been asked 1 million times. This is your space to ask different questions.
Essentially, we worked on everything together. Mike Carlin had the genius idea of creating sort of a Marvel bullpen out of the Superman books. So a couple of times a year, DC would fly every writer, every penciler, every inker, and even the colorist all together into one room. And we would workshop the stories for the next year all together on a big chart, and decide what was going to happen to Superman and all his supporting cast for the year. And one year we had that all worked out. We had a 5-day meeting, I think, 5-day meeting, where we had worked out the basic story arcs for the next year, leading up to the marriage of Lois and Clark. And at the time, the TV show Lois and Clark was about to come onto the air for the first time. And it was decided at the last minute by Mike and Jeanette, pretty smartly, I think, that wouldn't it be cool if we postponed the marriage so that when we did do the marriage, maybe Lois and Clark on the TV show would be getting married too, and you could have the TV show supporting the comic and the comic supporting the TV show. It's pretty smart marketing move. And I wish it had actually happened exactly that way. But at the time, we were very frustrated, because it meant that 3 days of work was out the window, and we had to start over with a whole new plot for the year. And Jerry Ordway, Maestro Ordway, who should be on your show.
He's invited if he wants to be here, of course.
He really should. He's the reason that we killed Superman, because he had this joke that he would pull out whenever we got stuck, whenever we were writing a story and we would get stuck on a plot point and didn't know where to go next. Maestro Ordway from the back would pipe up and say, "And then we kill him." So this time when Ordway said, let's just kill him, Louise spoke up. Now, Louise Simonson, one of the greatest writers and greatest editors in comics, had been the editor of the X-Men during its most significant and most important run.
Absolutely.
And as editor of the X-Men, she had supervised the death of many characters. And so when Jerry said, "Well, let's just kill him," Louise leaned forward and said, "You know what you get from killing a character is you get to tell the story of what that character meant to the world. You get to show what that story meant. You get to tell the story of what that character meant to all the people who knew him, all the people who loved him, even his enemies. It's the reaction of the world and all the other characters that make the story. And we started to think about that. We started to think about how much Superman meant to all of us personally,
Mhm.
and how we'd like to make our audience feel that way too. Because at the time, it was sort of the dark and gritty age of comic books, and everything was Batman and Punisher and Wolverine, and we felt like people were sort of missing the point on Superman. So we started to think about what Louise said, and the story we could tell, the stories we could tell about the world reacting to the death of Superman. And we actually wrote Funeral for a Friend before we actually even tackled the death at all.
Mm-hmm.
And we had all of this, we had the beautiful moment of Bibbo saying it should have been him. We had the moment of Ma and Pa Kent watching the funeral for their son on television because they couldn't be there. They couldn't, admit who he was. We had the story of Lois and the world all around Superman written before we even considered Doomsday or the fight, because that for us was the emotional power of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so the death of Superman happened because of Maestro Ordway's classic joke, which he trotted out at every meeting several times, and Louise Simonson, who really said, "You know what you get from killing a character."
Mm-hmm. Okay, Felipe asks, when did you start working on the license on licensing? Do you still do it, or an alternative with your other jobs?
I started with the licensing artwork. I think it started. Do you remember Zero Hour?
Yeah.
0 Hour was a crossover we did on the Superman books, and Louise wrote this story where Batman from different dimensions was showing up in Metropolis because of this weird space-time thing that was happening, in that was 0 Hour was.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a story to draw with, and I had to depict Batmans from different dimensions. And I came upon the really overly ambitious idea to draw the Batmans from every different dimension in the style of important Batman artists from the era.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to learn how to draw Bob Kane, Neil Adams, Dick Sprang, Shelley Moldoff, all the Batman artists, Bruce Timm,
Mm-hmm.
all the Carmen Infantino, Murphy Anderson. I had to teach myself how to draw in their styles to draw this story. And it was really hard, and it took a really long time, and they had to put in a fill-in afterwards because I blew my deadline, which I hate to do, but that time it was a lot of work. And fortunately, it paid off in that it kind of became a landmark issue. And because of that, the folks at DC Licensing started to call me, saying, "Can you do a drawing in the style of Kurt Swan, or can you do a drawing in the style of sort of a combined Silver Age look, or can you design this Golden Age Superman statue for us, or whatever?"
Mm-hmm.
So it started out drawing that period stuff, and then when Maestro Garcia Lopez was not available to do something, they'd sometimes throw it to me, or even occasionally there would be a particular client who didn't like something about a Garcia Lopez drawing, if you can believe that. So they would say to me, "Can you fix this neck on Garcia Lopez?" Which is just ridiculous. How do you fix perfection? But anyway, I would do Garcia Lopez-esque drawings.
Mm-hmm.
and I had, like for instance, I had a job once. They'd hired Carmen Infantino before Carmine died to draw some Batmans, and what they really wanted was Batman as Carmine drew him in 1966, but Carmine drew him as modern Batman.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as post Dark Knight. And they didn't feel like they could go back and say, no, Carmen, you have to do this over. So what they did was they came to me and they said, here are Carmine's pencils for Batman. Can you turn them into Carmine from 1966 and ink them like Murphy Anderson?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I did that on the light box because I didn't want to. I mean, I can't redraw Carmine on his own pencils. It would be wrong. So I think I might have scanned and printed them, and then I repenciled them to look more 1966. It was very interesting because it was all there because it was Carmine. It was all there. It just needed to be tweaked a little bit. And then I inked it like Murphy Anderson. And I had already pretty much mastered Murphy. So I did licensing work for about 15 years, off and on, between other projects. But after a while, the thing about licensing work is it's totally anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
No one knows it's you, right? And you might see a product in the store and say, oh, I think that's my Superman. Is that mine or is that Garcia Lopez? No, that's mine. But other than that, it's anonymous work. And more important, it's not narrative work.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a storyteller at heart. And so I find the licensing stuff, it was very useful and very educational for me, because by forcing myself to draw in the style of other artists, or to just draw in a sort of a universal DC house style, I learned a lot about drawing. But after a while, I missed telling stories, and I missed drawing in my own style. So I moved on.
Pedro de Mercader asks, did you have diversity or inclusion issues when you made the decision to create Steel as a black character?
Well, here's an illustration of my white privilege. We didn't even think about him being black. I loved the truest. John Henry is an American folktale, but he's actually based on a real person. There was, in fact, a man, a former slave, who helped build the railroads across this country, who fought for the rights of workers and the dignity of humans, and did, in fact, battle a new steam-driven drill and beat it. So the character of John Henry, the legend of John Henry, is actually based on historical fact. The fact that it's not taught as history is due to the racism of this country, but he actually existed. And I grew up loving the legend, loving the story, and for some reason identifying with the character. So when Wheezy pointed out that he was in fact historical fact, that was really when we decided to base our character on that legend. And we weren't consciously, I think, trying to be diverse. And I don't know, I don't think either of us thought about cultural appropriation. But we were thinking about several things. One, this is a character who should be this is a true historical character who should be honored in superhero terms, right? Who should be a superhero, because he sort of was in real life. Also, DC doesn't really have an Iron Man, and we'd like to give DC its own Iron Man type of character, but he didn't have to be a billionaire because DC already had the #1 billionaire superhero. So maybe our twist on an Iron Man character would to have him be sort of a DIY Iron Man character, a working man, because John Henry was a hero of the working class. So he could be a working class Iron Man. And that's what we were thinking about more than, oh my God, we're creating an iconic black superhero. I mean, probably John Henry should have been created by black creators. It was not our intention to do any sort of cultural appropriation. It was our intention to write and draw a character that we loved, a character that captured the heart of Superman. I mean, that's really what we were after. Is each one of the Reign of Superman replacement Supermans was an aspect of the character, and for us, the essence of Superman was really his heart. So we wanted to translate that into an Iron Man character based on the historical John Henry. But you can't do that without making a black character, because John Henry, the historical John Henry, was black. So it wouldn't have made any sense to try and make him white. And just frankly, from an artistic standpoint, I never got to draw enough black characters. And just as an artist, diversity is more interesting. You know, it's more interesting to have female characters. It's more interesting to draw kid superheroes. It's more interesting to draw black characters. I mean, you know, variety is the spice of life. And if you're a character artist who likes drawing people, don't you want to draw all kinds of people? So we just blundered ahead and created Steel in our ignorance and privilege, but we created him because we love him, and I continue to love that character, and I'm actually really proud of that character. And you know, if anybody feels like I stepped on his toes or in any way disrespected Black lives or anything like that, I apologize, but I don't apologize for Steel.
Look who's here. Jose Luis Garcia Lopez is making a comment on the chat.
What?
Yeah, I was lucky to see his first, I guess, Superman pages in Mike Carlin's office years ago. Wonderful work. I was envious of how well he handled the character.
Oh my God. Maestro, you are one of my heroes.
That's real. I'm not making this up. He came into the chat to say this.
Jesus.
Breathe.
Steve, I'm sorry for redrawing your necks.
Okay. Next one.
That's amazing. He's one of the greatest artists who ever lived.
Yep.
My only regret about Garcia Lopez is he spent so much time doing licensing work that he hasn't done enough narrative work, and his narrative work is phenomenal. It's just so deliciously real, you know, without being a photograph tracer. There are an awful lot of photograph tracers out there in comics now. Maestro Garcia Lopez draws a world that feels more real than any other artist. It just feels like his Metropolis is really Metropolis. His Gotham City is a place where you could go. And when I read a Garcia Lopez story, a narrative story, I feel like I can fall into the panel border and look around the panel and feel and see everything there. And he creates this incredible sense of natural realism while simultaneously having characters that act and gesture as naturally and really as I aspire to.
Okay, next, changing the subject. Breathe now. Rita Carambola says, I get the impression that you've been kind of unlucky with your inkers. Not saying that they are not good, but they usually don't. I don't think they fit well with your style. I really only liked Stan Drake in Power Pack, and I think artists as Al Williamson would have been great if they teamed up with you. What do you think about this?
Actually, I was really, really lucky to be inked by Hilary Barta. I absolutely love Hilary's work on me. So I feel in that way I was extraordinarily lucky. I've also been inked by Bob Wyacek, masterfully, Terry Austin.
Yeah.
So I've got no complaints. I think stylistically that Bob and Terry's work doesn't fit with my style exactly. But they bring so much of their own genius to it that I don't feel bad about the result at all. I've also been inked by some people, like occasionally I've been inked by great masters who I have tried to cater to. So for instance, I did a job that was inked by Maestro Klaus Janson, where I tried to draw for him. And in fact, the second job I ever did in comics was inked by Al Williamson. So naturally, I tried to, make it look as Al Williamson-y as possible. And I've been inked by John Romita Sr. So I've had a lot of good inkers. I haven't always meshed with them, but like for instance, Dennis Janke is a friend of mine, and we've done some good work together, and we've done some not so good work together. We spent most of our 8 years together struggling to find the perfect combination, right? And sometimes we were better than others, and sometimes we were way, way off. And that's not his fault, and it's not my fault. It's just chemistry. But I think that generally speaking, I've been pretty lucky with inkers. I've been inked by Dick Giordano. I've been inked by Al Williamson. I've been inked by Klaus Janson. I've been inked by John Romita Sr. I've been inked by Jerry Teleak. So I've had great inks from a lot of people. And I think my run on Power Pack inked by Hilary Barta was better than I could have done myself. It's true that I mostly ink myself now. And I like my own inks better than anyone's inks. But there is something magic that happens in collaboration, and you have to give something up to receive that magic, right? You have to give up a certain amount of control and let the inker have their way about certain things, and recognize that they're not just there to trace you. They are an artist in themselves, and what you produce together is a combination, a union of both your works. And sometimes it works great, and sometimes it doesn't work so great. but it's always a learning experience. Even with the worst inkers, it's always a learning experience. And if you can let go of control enough to trust your inker, I find that, at least in my life, I have been pleased more often than disappointed.
I don't think, maybe meshing more or less. I don't think nobody can say with the names of inkers you had during your career, that you haven't had some of the best in the business by far during the last 30 years. Klaus, Terry, Hillary, Al Williamson, and everybody else. Just it's like a who's who. So like, okay, maybe this one or this other one didn't mess that well. It's like, but you know what? It's Klaus Janson, Hillary Barta, Terry Austin, Bob Wiasek, and all the others. Like, yeah, you know what? You have your share of amazing inkers in your career.
And part of the fun, really, of having an inker is that pairing, right? Like, it's like, gee, I wonder how my work would look if I were inked by Dick Giordano in the classic Dick Giordano style, or I wonder how my work would look if I got classic JR Senior type inking. And a lot of times, some of the inks that are most controversial, like a lot of I've heard some people diss Al Williamson for his inks on me on X Factor, but I asked for those inks. I asked for Al on those because I wanted a thick, black, inky, brushy style on that. And Al gave me exactly what I was looking for. Did it always work? No. But I like a lot of that stuff. Boy, Al Milgrom is one of the forgotten geniuses of the business because he was a utility guy and did a lot of like rush jobs. People often underestimate what that guy's capable of. But I appreciate, I'm a fan of Rita's, and I appreciate that she knows my pencil work and has a strong opinion about how it should be inked. I appreciate that very much. But I'm really not disappointed by any of my inkers.
Felipe says Superman Aliens 2 was an excellent comic book with a great story and art. Do you have fond memories of it?
Of course. Yes. I mean, it was my life dream to work on Superman. I was the kid with the towel tied around his neck, jumping off the neighbor's carport. I couldn't afford a store-bought Superman costume, so I made one out of some old pajamas and a towel and crayons, and I wore that under my clothes to school for 2 years. So yes, drawing Superman was my life dream, and I have to say, pretty much at every turn, not just Superman, but pretty much at every turn, my experience in comic books has been everything I ever would have hoped for when I was a fan.
But he was asking specifically about Superman Aliens, if you like that project.
Oh, Superman Aliens, I'm sorry. Well, I drew that expressly to be inked by Kevin Nolan. I mean, really, I think I like Kevin's work a lot, and that relates perfectly to Rita's question, because that was just a situation where I was curious as to what I would look like inked by Kevin Nolan. Really liked his work, particularly at the time, and so that's what that was about. I'd never worked with Chuck Dixon before, so that seemed like fun. But really, it was a chance to do, the New Gods and Apocalypse and Aliens, and to be inked by Kevin Nolan. I mean,
Yeah. Logan Howard asks, In which, well, let me retranslate because I don't understand his English. I think he's asking which is the work that if you feel is your best work ever and that you have most fond memories of.
It's a toss-up. Well, I'll give you some highlights. I liked very much everything I ever did on Power Pack. Of these, I think, wow, you're asking me to choose among all my children.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Really hard. I really love Power Pack, everything on Power Pack. The Inferno stories I thought were, although they were, I think, too dark for Power Pack, were also really good. I love the Elsewhere story in Power Pack. I love the stories, the two-parter where we took them to an island in Maine where I really have a house. I loved everything with Louise, but especially those early stories set in New York, because Judy and I lived in New York, not far from the Simonsons, and I could photograph all those locations and make them absolutely real. I really enjoyed doing that. On Superman, besides, of course, the death of Superman and particular scenes in that, I loved doing my Mxyzptlk stories. I'm very proud of having contributed to the writing of a 22-page fart joke. And I'm also very, very proud of the 3-part Holocaust story we did in Superman and Man of Steel 80, 81, and 82, which I don't know what that came out as in Spain, but that one where Superman, it's 3 parts. He battles domestic Nazis, with probably, there's a page from that story that has been reprinted and appeared on the internet more times than anything else I've ever drawn. And then he goes to the Warsaw Ghetto and liberates the Warsaw Ghetto. And those were hard issues to draw because I had to immerse myself in Holocaust history. But I think the result is very good. And I've gotten some really good feedback from, from the chief prosecutor of war crimes in the State Department. He sent me a very complimentary note. He liked it better than Schindler's List. And very nice words from the Holocaust Museum curator, and so I'm proud of that one for its historical accuracy, and I really liked drawing in the style of Joe Shuster. So yeah, those are probably my career highlights. The thing is, though, I kind of fall in love with anything that I'm doing, right? So whenever I look at my old work, which isn't that often, it always brings back what was going on in my life at the time. So it's almost impossible to separate the work from the memory of the regular joys of my life.
Are you and Chris or Luis thinking about doing anything else together? Somewhere, sometime? Oh,
I don't know. I'm not thinking that far ahead. I'm not really thinking about what to do after this sci-fi series that I'm working on. I would work with Chris or Louise again anytime. If either of them asked me to draw a thing, I would draw a thing. Period.
I think that's really clear. Okay, so just so you know, we just crossed the 12 no, the 2 hour mark. So
Really?
I think we should be, like, you have a life, you have to work.
Yeah.
So let me show this to people just so you see how brilliant you are. This is a gift John gave me in Heroes Comic Con Madrid. As you see, exceptional drawing because the guy is exceptional as an artist and as a human being.
Was it Madrid or was that Valencia?
Valencia, yes.
Yeah.
What did I say?
You said Comic Con Madrid.
Whatever. See, I am lost all my Marlboros already. Thank you so much for being here. To you, John.
Thanks
It's
for
been
having me.
amazing. You are an amazing man and a really good friend. And I hope to see you really soon.
I hope to see you in person
Yeah.
really soon.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
Vaccinated, masked or unmasked. I hope we can see each other again soon.
There you go. Please don't cut the connection because I want to say proper goodbye to you after I cut the feed. So,
All right.
but for now, thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Tomorrow with us, artists Javier Rodríguez and Natasha Bustos. Natasha Bustos and Javier Rodríguez. En español, in Spanish, as every Tuesday. See you all tomorrow. Thank you, John. Thank you, all of you. Goodbye.
Gracias a todos.